And greetings, friends. Today I want to talk to you about 1 Corinthians 14th chapter, verse 34 and 35, that says this: "Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. And if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in the church." Now, a lot of people take this to mean, especially the churches of God, Seventh-day churches of God, they take this to mean that women are not allowed to preach the Word of God in the church of God. But really, when you look at the New Testament, you see women prophesying, and it was sanctioned by the Apostle Paul. 1 Corinthians, the 11th chapter, verse 5, shows that women were prophesying in the church. Acts, the 21st chapter, verse 9, we see women prophesying in the Word of God. We also see in the Old Testament, Miriam was a prophetess. And if she was a prophetess, well, then she prophesied. Prophesy means not just predicting future events, but inspired speaking. We see in the book of Joel, that's quoted in the book of Acts, the 2nd chapter, it says that in the end time my spirit will be poured upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your handmaids I will pour out my spirit, says God. So we see them prophesying, preaching in the church, preaching in the Old Testament. Is this a contradiction? Did Paul contradict himself when he said that women should not speak in the church? Well, when we look at the context, we see that that is not the subject at all. Notice what it says in verse 33. It says, "For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all churches of the saints." And then in verse 40 it says, "Let all things be done decently and in order." That's the context. There was confusion in the church, and there was disorder in the church, and things were going wrong where things weren't being done decently. And the Apostle Paul was dealing with what was going on in the church of confusion and disorder. Now, what was going on in the church? Well, to understand this, we must understand that, number one, when the church met, especially in the first century, because the apostles were Jews, well, they met in synagogues. And you read that in Acts 15th chapter, verse 21, where we see that the Christians were going to the synagogue every Sabbath and learning out of the law of God. They were learning out of the law of God. So we see Christians keeping the Sabbath in the New Testament. Now, we also see in the New Testament Sosthenes, who was called our brother in 1 Corinthians, the 1st chapter, verse 1. And he was the chief ruler of the synagogue, Acts, the 18th chapter, verse 17. So we see Christians in synagogues. And in James, the 2nd chapter, it says, "For if there come unto your assembly a man with a gold ring." That word assembly, when you look at Strong's 4864, it's synagogue. And Robertson's Word Pictures writes, "The common word for the gathering of Jews to worship." That was the word they used, synagogue. And it was particularly a building where they met. And we also see in history, in the 4th century, an inscription has "synagogue for a meeting house of certain Christians." That's in Robertson Word Pictures. The word ecclesia is church, and church doesn't mean a building. It means the people of God, God's called out ones. The synagogue was the meeting place or building where they met to assemble. So they met in synagogues. They built their own synagogues. Now, in the synagogue, women and men were separated. They were segregated. We had the men on one part of the synagogue, women on the other part of the synagogue. Now notice what the Apostle Paul is saying here. It says, "And if they will learn anything." Now how do we learn? Well, through sermons. Here is the pastor preaching a sermon. And what was the confusion? Well, again, they were segregated, women and men, and the women were creating considerable disorder by calling across to their husbands, asking for clarification of certain points in the sermon. And Paul commanded them to stop bringing this confusion into the church and wait and ask their husbands at home about anything that wasn't clear. So when it says here, for it is a shame for women to speak in the church, the shame was speaking out loud in the church, causing confusion and disorder. That's what was going on in the church. The minister of the church was telling them to be silent, and they would not be silent, hence not subjecting themselves to the authority of the leadership of the church. And that's what it says when it says to be obedient, as also saith the law, to be obedient to the leaders of the church. So this is what was going on in the church. The subject of preaching and teaching in the church wasn't even the subject here. The subject was women yelling across, causing disorder, confusion, not listening to the leadership. This is what was going on in the church, and Paul was saying to keep silent in the churches, and that if you need to learn something, wait till you get home and ask your husbands for clarification, and not to yell out and cause confusion and disorder in the church. It's got nothing to do with preaching the Word of God in the church. As I mentioned to you, there are examples in the New Testament, the Old Testament, of women prophesying, meaning inspired speaking, preaching and teaching the Word of God in the church. Miriam was a prophetess. Deborah, in Judges the 4th chapter, she was a prophetess, and she prophesied the Word of God to Israel. Many examples of women in the church, in the Old Testament, preaching the Word of God. So to say that these scriptures prove that women can't preach and teach the Word of God in the church is just another Bible misconception.